Mizzou's football roster is full of talent, but maybe not as many sure things as you would like.
You are Locked On Mizzou, your daily podcast on the Missouri Tigers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, all you true sons and daughters, I'm John Miller, your Mizzou mafioso and the central scrutinizer of Missouri Tigers football and basketball. On today's program, I'm going to try to explain the House settlement as best as I can and also talk about Missouri's latest high school recruit, the ubiquitous Jabari Brady. Before I start the program, I want to remind you today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. New customers can get $200 in bonus bets with their first $5 bet when it wins. So again, go to FanDuel.com or the app to get started. And you know what? I'm going to get started today by talking about Missouri's top 6 players as I ranked them for this upcoming 2025 Mizzou football team. And why the top 6? Why not the top 5, you might ask? Well, because that's what Locked On asked me to do recently. The entire network is going to start compiling a whole bunch of lists here for this offseason. As part of this exercise, all the hosts were asked to list the top 6 on their football rosters. And I thought this was a good exercise on a number of different levels, and it definitely taught me something about this Missouri roster, and that was, cutting it down to 6 guys was pretty difficult on a couple of different levels. Number one, Missouri has a bunch of talent, but number two, Missouri has a bunch of question marks at the same time too. So let's just get into it here. Number one is, well, if you're an everydayer and a very close listener of this program, as you might have guessed, Chris McClellan is the first guy I wrote down. I immediately knew that McClellan, the Missouri defensive lineman on the interior, was going to be a member of my top 6. Whether he's actually the number one top guy on the roster, I didn't necessarily feel like parsing all that much. I just knew he was going to be in my top 6, and I felt the same way about Dalen Carnell, the Missouri star, strong safety, to use the more traditional phrasing there, but really the hybrid linebacker safety position there. A former corner is Dalen Carnell coming out of high school. To me, his versatility is just something you absolutely need in college football in 2025 to be able to play the run and the pass and, well, just blitz the quarterback occasionally and the line of scrimmage with absolute reckless abandon. I continue to think Carnell has NFL potential in 2026. My next guy, Kevin Coleman, replacing more or less Luther Burden in the slot position there. He was an all-SEC type of performer last season at Mississippi State, so he's a guy that I feel pretty comfortable putting in this top 6, regardless of the fact that he hasn't played it down for Missouri. And speaking of newcomers, how about Ahmad Hardy? There's a guy I think who is so talented, the former Louisiana Monroe running back. He's a guy I honestly think could put up Cody Schrader-like numbers for Missouri this season if the offensive line is up to snuff. I think that's what it's going to take. I think Hardy is going to get enough touches, and is he going to get all the carries? Well, I don't even think it matters. I think Missouri's going to run the ball frequently enough and hopefully effectively enough that touches shouldn't be an issue. But again, another newcomer here in Ahmad Hardy. And then finally, my last 2 spots go to 2 Missouri defensive ends. I think your front 7 is where this roster is the most loaded right now. Returning player Zion Young, who, of course, had the scoop and score against Oklahoma to win the game last season. And also Damon Wilson, the transfer from Georgia. Again, another relative unknown here, a newcomer to the Mizzou football roster, but not a newcomer to the SEC, not an unknown to people like Brian Smith, the scoutmaster, who thinks Wilson is just an absolute dude and a real high upside performer. Clint Shamblin, my colleague over at Locked On Bulldogs, of course, who covers Georgia, he says the exact same thing. He thinks Wilson is going to be an absolute stud and a find for Missouri. So really, this is based off of more of my colleagues' opinions and how much I trust what they say over my own. I'll give it to them, having both of those guys have seen much more of Damon Wilson than I have. So, end of the day here, once again, my list was McClellan, Carnell, and Zion Young. Those are your three guys who were actually on the roster for Mizzou last season. And then three newcomers in the transfer portal, Kevin Coleman, Ahmad Hardy, and Damon Wilson. So you got, again, three new guys, three old guys. Just goes to show you, and by the way, since none of those guys were a quarterback, none of those guys were a left tackle, none of those guys were a cornerback. Yes, two pass rushers. To me, those are the top four. Those are the big four positions on any football team that if you're going to be strong anywhere, those would be the four. Again, quarterback, tackle, and then on the defensive side, also corner and pass rusher. That's where I'd want to be strong over anything. The good news for Missouri is I definitely considered a couple offensive linemen, Caden Green and Connor Tollison in that top six. It was just hard for me to put either one of those guys in there ahead of who I listed already. And plus, just for positional value alone, I think the tackle positions are the more premium positions. I don't think a lot of people would disagree with me there. I also thought many of those safety transfers from Santana Banner to many others, I think have a chance to sneak into that top six group by the end of the season. The linebackers for Missouri are really strong as well. So ultimately, end of the day, this is where I ended up right now. It just tells me that while there was a ton of different options here, at the same time, I don't know that anybody's going to say that Missouri's top six is the absolute strongest in the entire league or even in the top five. So, and that's mostly based on potential and not really totally answered questions at this point. So that tells you, I think, a lot of what you need to know about the Missouri roster right now. And while all the major teams in college football right now, at least most of them, I would say, including the Missouri Tigers, are emphasizing high school football a little bit less, it certainly isn't dead by any stretch of the imagination. It looks like the Tigers may have gotten a modicum of revenge on the Miami Hurricanes, who just stole Jackson Cantwell out of the state borders of Missouri. So let's talk about the ubiquitous Jabari Brady coming up here in just a minute. But first, the NBA playoffs are in full swing, and every night delivers highlight-worthy performances, and you don't want to miss out on any of it. And, of course, FanDuel makes it so easy to keep you in the game before the tip-off and live as well. We're talking player props, same-game parlays, which players are showing up in the biggest moments, all of that good stuff. FanDuel has so many options. It truly is ridiculous. And even after, well, just to give you a lay of the land here, even after the Pacers upset Oklahoma City in the first game for the series, well, the Pacers still significant underdogs here at plus 410. Oklahoma City minus 550. The Thunder 5-point favorites for Game 3. No matter what your angle is, you got to play it at FanDuel. It's the perfect time to sign up. Head to FanDuel.com and place your first $5 bet. If it wins, you'll get $200 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, official sports betting partner of the NBA. Once again, Jabari Brady is your latest high school recruit for Missouri, listed about 6'1", 6'2", 205 pounds from Fort Lauderdale, Florida. And he was all over the place in high school. And, excuse me, and while he looks to be, I would say, just based on a quick viewing of his skill set, seems probably more well-suited to play the outside receiver positions at the college level. He definitely played in the slot at receiver as well, and heck, he even played outside corner and inside corner based on his tape in high school. So that shows some real IQ, I would say, a knower of ball, if you will. And heck, he was even punting that thing in his high school tape. So Jabari Brady, obviously he's not going to be a punter at the high school level. Missouri is not recruiting him to do so, but I really do believe that shows some real football acumen there and know-how, and that seems really interesting to me, the fact that he's able to play multiple positions on offense and defense and play some special teams as well, not just as a return man, but as a true specialist. That's really interesting. An unusual player is Jabari Brady, and most had been predicting, at least one outlet I saw had been predicting a while, that Brady was going to end up as a Miami Hurricane, essentially the hometown team there close to Fort Lauderdale. Well, he had multiple visits to Miami, but also Ohio State, Georgia, Florida State. So some really excellent company here for Jabari Brady. A real interesting prospect, a guy who seems to high point the football well, again, physical receiver that he is, more than a true speed demon type of player. I think Jabari Brady really interesting, again, to me, just based on how many guys do you see, especially in 2025, playing almost literally all over the field like that? That's impressive stuff. And with what has been referred to as the House settlement coming to a close here this past weekend, well, if amateurism wasn't dead, it was certainly on life support, and now it has been officially flatlined. And just a lot to get to with all of this, quite honestly, and I'll try to parse through it as best I can. One thing, there's going to be $1.8 billion in back damages paid to players from 2016 until now via the NCAA. But really, from a Missouri fans' perspective, the most interesting thing here is that it's expected there's going to be a $20.5 million salary cap, for lack of a better term at this point, where athletes will now be able to be paid directly by their own schools. So essentially, this means that the collectives are probably going to be dead, the NIL collectives. Although NIL is still probably going to be, and I should say, is certainly going to still be a thing, but more for its intended purposes and not so much as an inducement for recruitment. At least that's what's being talked about in theory. How it's going to actually look in practice is something more like this, where, well, if $20.5 million is as much as the University Missouri can spend, for example, on sports, well, it's expected that this is the conventional wisdom here, that say about 90% of that money is probably going to men's football and well, there isn't women's football, is there? To football and men's basketball. So the Title IX implications, I have to admit, I don't know how exactly that's all going to work out. And it sure seems to me that there's potential litigation still to be done regarding all of that. But if, say, Missouri spends 75% on football, 15% on men's basketball, and 10% on the rest, for instance, well, that means there's only about $15 million to spend on football. Well, heck, Missouri spent 10% of that on Bo Prabula this past cycle alone. That means that NIL is still very much going to remain a thing to make up for, I would say, that shortfall there. But also, the idea that it's not going to be a recruiting mechanism, I find that a little bit hard to believe. Even in a world where a clearinghouse is going to exist that purportedly is going to assess whether say a player like Bo Prabula, for example, gets a deal to appear at a car dealership, do signings, appear in advertisements, that sort of thing. Nothing wrong with that, but who is to say what is a fair market value there? It just seems to me there is a lot of wiggle room there. Not that I'm against guys going out there and using their name, image, and likeness to make a few bucks at a car dealership. That doesn't bother me whatsoever. It's this whole clearinghouse thing that I'm a little bit shaky on. Who is going to determine this and how? And it just, again, there just seems to be a lot of wiggle room there. The idea that this won't be a recruiting inducement. I think in theory, the idea is, okay, let's get the boosters and that type of deal, the big money influences. Sure, they're still going to be there, but let's get them out of the direct negotiations and leave that to the schools. The problem is, as I see it at least, anytime you put a cap on this type of deal, especially when there is another mechanism out there called NIL, again, sure seems like there is a lot of wiggle room between what is my perceived fair market value and what is Bo Prabula's fair perceived market value, or the car dealerships, or the NCAA's, or anybody else's. This is all completely subjective and very unclear on how all of this is going to play out, in my opinion. What is clear, though, is that basically amateurism is dead, and whether athletes are technically, legally speaking, whether they're employees or not, I would say for all intents and purposes, they absolutely are. What still remains unclear is a few things, though, honestly, like just how binding some of these contracts really are. How is eligibility going to work out as far as, well, the Diego Pavia rule, for example, who's now playing his, 6th year of college football? How long can you really play college sports at this point? How much enforcement does NCAA still have at this point? All of these, in terms of just being able to bring the hammer down with law breaking and all that kind of stuff as they used to. Obviously, we haven't seen much of that in the past few years or so. So the deal is, starting this summer, among other things, any endorsement deal between a booster and an athlete, once again, must be vetted by a clearinghouse for, quote, a valid business purpose rather than a recruiting incentive. And, of course, the biggest thing of all, these universities are now going to be able to pay their athletes directly. And it seems to me there could be some real big unintended consequences of the salary cap, as I'm going to call it. I don't think anybody in official positions is calling it. But if you're a fan of pro sports, you know that it might as well be a salary cap. That's the simplest way to put it at this point. And anytime you put a cap on something like that, well, there's just going to be a lot of room for chicanery. And it really seems like the purpose of said cap, it's certainly not to protect the kids. It's to protect the big money people from all of these costs spiraling out of control. Hey, all that TV money we get from Disney, we'd like to keep that to ourselves. And speaking of big money people, how about, at least indirectly, just a tiny bit more on Bill Laurie? Because regardless of whether Laurie's involved or not, this hiring of Tim Fuller really does show that Dennis Gates is not messing around. And also, we know when the tip-off for border war is going to be this year. I'll tell you when, after these quick words. And it seems only appropriate that the border war returns to the border on December 7th. Yes, Pearl Harbor Day coming up this season. Missouri and Kansas will be going at it in Kansas City this time, in the Sprint Center. I believe it's the T-Mobile Center now. It's tough to keep all of these corporate name changes, tough to keep them all straight. But I do believe it is the T-Mobile Center now in Kansas City. Regardless, you know what building I'm talking about, down in Power and Light. So I'm definitely going to be getting my tickets. Hope to see a bunch of you down there for that game. And speaking of Missouri basketball, talked quite a bit, of course, about the Tim Fuller hiring, which seemingly came out of nowhere, but obviously did not. As I maintained, obviously this is something that Dennis Gates, had put a ton of thought into. He didn't just randomly one day say, maybe Tim Fuller might be a decent guy to hire for the general manager. The Tigers and Gates had been looking into this particular position for a long time, and considering how unusual it is throughout all of college basketball for an assistant coach in basketball in particular to leave, to get fired, whatever way you want to look at it, leave in less than ideal circumstances, and that was especially the case in some ways in Fuller's case about a decade ago, well, they usually don't come back. And in fact, give me one example in the history of Missouri basketball where that has happened. Imagine Michael Porter Sr. coming back on the Missouri bench, for example, or Tony Harvey, for that matter. That's about the level of surprise and sort of unlikeliness that there is to this. So what that tells me is that Dennis Gates, number one, has a bunch of really good reasons in his mind for bringing Fuller into the fold here. And also it shows to me that Dennis Gates is not messing around here. He's not just thinking, hey, let's just, sit around and hopefully we'll try to win some ball games here, and we'll stay at least on the bubble here at Missouri, and I'll cash a bunch of checks. I think for all of that, for the talk of Dennis Gates, hey, we're going to win national championships here and all that stuff, well, there have been less of that talk after the 0-19 season from Dennis Gates directly himself. But I'll tell you this, I don't think those ambitions have cooled whatsoever. Maybe it's more that Gates is speaking softly and carrying a big stick here, to use yet another reference to American history here in the last segment of the program. But that's the way I'm looking at this. I think Gates is just absolutely all in on this season, but especially the future of Missouri basketball right now. I think he's not just one of these guys who's bemoaning, the old days, I wish they'd come back. He is going to try with his best to mold to the new days as much as he possibly can. And whether he's successful or not, we're just going to have to find out. But at the very least, I think this move by hiring Fuller, I should say, once again, it should take just a ton of things off of Dennis Gates' plate. And that should only be a good thing on the actual basketball court itself, him being able to use more of his time and resources and the rest of the staff as well on simply focusing on what's happening in front of them on the court instead of everything else happening in the world of college sports and college basketball specifically. That just seems like every year there's something else that is sort of put on his plate. Thank God there's somebody there to take it off. I'll tell you that. I'm sure that's what he's thinking right now. But hey, here's what I'm thinking. Thanks for joining me here on today's edition of Locked On Mizzou, and thanks for making Locked On Mizzou your first listen every day. And for your second listen, check out the portal. My guy, the Scoutmaster, Brian Smith, well, he's a genius. Come on, it's as simple as that. Find the portal on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. And until next time, I'm John Miller. This has been Locked On Mizzou.